Appreciate it. All right. So for starters, there are a few sources that I relied on pretty heavily for coming up with the material here. So I want to give you the opportunity to take a look at those. Write them down if you'd like. Take a picture of that if you'd like. While I mention a few notes. One thing, I'm going to come down here and wander around. I'm not the important thing here. So if you can't see me, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Another thing is I'm going to make reference to the book Noise by Kahneman, Sibony, and Sunstein several times. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to refer to them collectively only as Kahneman. The last thing is that, let's see. Although analytics and statistics really are separate fields, I'm going to be talking about them interchangeably or collectively, mostly because we as coaches typically are going to encounter statistics and analytics together. So with that said, what are we going to be talking about? Yes, I definitely have opinions about what information, what data, what stats, what analytics are important and valid, but that's not what this is about. This is much more about us than it is about the data. It's about how we shape our understanding of the world, our understanding of our teams, within which we're going to use data and statistical methods. So there's a few key themes that I'm going to be talking about. One of them is the world is good at fooling us. The next one is that we don't want to feel foolish. And the third is that we're fools if we let the data drive. And I'm going to talk about those themes in the context of the search. To me, we are always searching for ways to get better. And better can mean a couple of different things, mainly. Better than our opponents, or winning, and better than our previous selves, or improvement. And whether we're using analytics and statistics currently or not, we're asking a lot of the same questions in the context of our searches. The main one to me is, what does better mean or look like? Another question that I think is very important amongst these is, how should we practice, scout, and compete in order to move towards better? It's time for you to do some work. We'll start out a little bit easy. I'll warm you up a little bit. I would like for you to write down. So there's extra spaces, not on my page, unfortunately, because I had too much to say. But there's extra pages, especially all the way in the back of the convention book, to write down, what does better look like in your world, on your teams? What does better mean to you? And what are some of your favorite places to look for ideas about what better can look like? Take some time to write those ideas down right now, please. So those of you who might be classroom teachers, time for a little turn and talk. All right, so I'd like you to take some of those ideas that you wrote down, and let's discuss them a little bit with our neighbors. Tell someone that you're sitting with, what does better look like for you in your world? Go for it. There you go.
And the same for the player. You're like, oh, coach. Like, to not have this. That to me is
All right. So don't worry, you're going to have more opportunities to talk, I promise. So I want to bring in someone that I'm fond of, Indiana Jones, to help illustrate the ideas that we're going to be talking about. So let's take a look. Our searches, right, our efforts to get better, to see a goal in the distance and to move ourselves towards it. And this is something that Indy has a lot of experience doing.
Brothers, hurry. There's nothing to fear here. That's what scares me.
Right? And so one of the things that I want us to recognize is that in general, we tend to think a lot like Satipo, the guide here. And we don't spend enough time thinking like Indiana Jones. And that's what this is really about. And so how does Indy think differently than Satipo? And how can we move towards that? The first thing is that Indy gets that performance is not linear. Performance is complex, nuanced, challenging, variable over time. And so we need to recognize that we are subject to the same forces as our players are in terms of that variability and complexity, the same types of complexities that Indy has to face. So let's talk about our first key theme. The world is good at fooling us. So how are our worlds and our teams good at fooling us? The first idea is that performance is overdetermined. The idea of overdetermination is that there are many factors that contribute to performances and outcomes that we are able to observe. The idea that, like, I'll use an example that Nate was talking about in the previous one, just about serving. And so for me, when I think about serving, there's a lot of different factors that can affect that. Our ability to receive serve, right? What's the lighting in the gym like? What was our travel like the day before? Did we have to play a match the day before? What's the sound of the crowd? All of these things make a difference. How sore is my arm? How tired are my legs? And each of these things is a factor that affects the outcome or our performance. But no one of those factors tells me the overall mechanism. That's what it means for things to be overdetermined. So each of those factors has an effect on the outcome, but we really don't know, and it's very difficult to assess how much of a factor it plays. How much of an effect does it have? All right, time to write. Pick a skill, preferably in volleyball, but really anything if you want to. You can think about your coaching if you'd like. Pick a skill and list some factors that might affect the variability in the performance of that skill? Please, write. All right, go ahead and let's share some of those ideas with one another. If you pick the same skill, then it should be interesting to see what sort of similarities you see. But maybe you pick different skills. But let's talk about what some of those factors that contribute to performances are, as you see them. All right. Now, I promise that I'm going to give you a little bit more time to discuss some stuff. I just kind of want to warm you up a little bit. Next idea here about how the world and our teams are good at fooling us is the idea that performance is variable, right? And we can only sample one match at a time, one practice at a time. And the problem that we have with that is that any one match or practice that we can sample is going to, it only approximates the value or the actual level of performance that a player or a team is capable of. But that one sample that we look at a time that we can wrap our heads around, that one sample is not necessarily going to be indicative of the overall level of performance. So how do we reconcile that? We've got to remember that that sample is only approximating a value. As Whelan put it in Naked Statistics, we cannot know whether our single observation represents the mean or an outlier. So let's take a look at what that can represent or how that can play out. So this animation is going to show us basically sampling techniques. So as we can see here, all up here at the top, we've got one practice or one match, one day, and all of these separate events that occurred during it. And then we're going to take that and we are going to analyze that. We're going to crunch those things down, typically into averages. We're going to condense that one day's performance down into a single dot. But what we see here is that over time, those random draws, those random samples, only approximate the mean or the actual level of performance. And even that actual level, that average, varies widely. See how the dots are spread out rather than always converging on a single point? So when Whelan says that we're talking that we don't know whether our single sample is a mean or an outlier, the truth is it's probably neither. It's probably somewhere in between. It's probably neither exactly on the average or really close to it, but it's also probably not super far spread out either. Newton described it this way. What we know is a drop. What we don't know is an ocean. And that's not so much about ignorance as it is that we sample one drop at a time. One practice, one match is one drop. And do we really think that that one drop that we see at a time is an adequate description of the ocean from which it comes? So I want to tell you a tale of two tailors to get at an idea, the idea of statistical significance versus practical significance. So I have two outside hitters. Their names are Taylor. And I think one of them gets more kills than the other one does. How do I figure out if that's true or not? Better, how do I figure out if that's accurate or not? Again, I have to sample. How much do I have to sample in order to figure out if these two Taylors are the same or they are different? That is statistical significance is the idea that underlies that. That if I sample enough, then the difference between them, no matter how small, becomes statistically significant. That I can confidently say that that difference between them is probably not due to chance. It is more than likely due to something else. We would like to think that that's skill. But how many samples do I need to take to get there? And then even once I do have that statistical significance, is that difference large enough? What is the scale that I'm thinking about? The scale that I'm considering? That's where we get into practical significance. What is it that allows me to feel like I can make a decision between these two Taylors and say Taylor 1 is better, or Taylor 1 is my O1, or whatever that decision might be? Practical significance means that the difference is large enough to matter. And for us, mattering means that it's something that will make me change my opinion or change my decision that I would make. So going back to the idea of performance is variable. Players aren't their averages, right? So that animation I showed you where we condense information down into single points, into averages. Here is a bar chart of one player's reception averages broken down by match. That horizontal line that you see is her overall reception average. Notice that any one match, like I said before, is neither the mean nor is it an outlier. And so this is my problem then when I'm considering my two Taylors, is that if I'm going to measure them based on what they did in the last match, where are they on this bar chart? Is that an accurate measurement? Is that a decision that I should confidently be making? Schultz describes that this way. Every one of us confuses our models of the world with the world itself. What that means for us is that we tend to think in averages because they're easy to calculate and they're easy for us to wrap our heads around them. But that is a model of the world, and it does not adequately describe the world which it is trying to describe. So we are confusing our models for the world itself. We're confusing our averages for what the players can actually do. And so that dissonance, that disconnect, leads us to say some really entertaining things about statistics, thinking that we understand what's happening. So we struggle with that uncertainty. We struggle with that noise. So let's think about it again. Time to do some writing. how might our world or our teams differ from the models that we have created of them? How do the numbers or our ideas about our teams, about the way the game is played, how do those models differ from the game itself? Go for it. Let's talk about it a little bit. And trust me on this one too. Look, sorry, thank you. So let's talk about it a little bit. And trust me, there is a reason why I'm asking you to write it first. So please do respect that and spend a little bit of time with that, because that is a process that I'd like you to get used to. Whoop, not too far. There we go. All right. I'm finding the limits of my remote. All right, so the next key theme here is that we don't want to feel foolish. All right, it's bad enough that the game wants us to be that way. We don't. And so us not wanting to be foolish puts us into what Kahneman calls the valley of the normal. This is one of the main problems that we have. The valley of the normal is the idea that a set of events can happen that all seem very normal and very explicable to us in retrospect. that when we see a particular outcome, that we can build back through the way it happened and be like, oh, yes, of course that's how it happened. How obvious, right? In the valley of the normal, things appear normal in hindsight, although they were not expected and although we could not have predicted them. This is also called hindsight bias. The idea that things that are easy to explain in the past should be easy to predict in the future. Now puts it this way. When we look at extraordinary accomplishments, we should keep in mind that they can arise from without extraordinary causes, right? So the idea here is that extraordinary events are also present in the valley of the normal. They are reasonable things that can happen, and we can explain them away. For instance, Illinois beats Kentucky in the second round. According to my friend Chad Gordon, who has joined us, that had roughly a 13% chance of happening. And yet, when that match was over, it was really easy for us to explain it as being something that we should have expected, something that we should have predicted, right? Well, if they only had a little bit more Skinner, they would have won, right? So this is what it means for us not to want to feel foolish. Another way we demonstrate that is that we want to feel like we're in control. We're coaches. This is what we do, right? So like me giving feedback to a player, I want to feel like my feedback has an effect. The truth is, if I'm watching a player rep out stuff in serve receive, and I'm not happy with one particular outcome that I see, so I step in and I say something. And then I step back. And she does something and she gets a better outcome, I'm a good coach. The truth is, if I would have shut my mouth and watched, as we saw from before, things may have been different the very next sample, whether I did something or not. And that's really hard for us to accept. Another thing we have here is that we really like to feel certain. Galef says that a large portion of overconfidence stems from a desire to feel certain. Right? I want to believe, not necessarily that I'm right or that I'm wrong, but just that I know where I stand. That's what we're talking about when we talk about certainty. But then, of course, we really like feeling like we're right. And this brings up a concept that Kahneman calls respect expertise. We as coaches are what are known to them as respect experts. Our expertise is based on the respect that we get from others, and that respect is, our expertise comes from that, mostly because the things that we are experts on are very difficult to define uncontroversially. Right? So what you think makes a good ball control player and what I think makes a good ball control player might be different. They might be very different. And we can both still be reasonably correct. Again, your turn. How might these biases, how might hindsight bias, how might wanting to feel certain, wanting to feel in control, wanting to feel right, detrimentally affect how teams practice and compete? Go for it. right, let's talk about it a little bit. Go for it.
Yeah, there are other ways of thinking about that. That's the first thing.
All right, so let's explore the last of my key themes here. We're fools if we let the data drive. So the idea here is that we're just sitting here talking about these biases, these ways in which we are making it hard to really understand what's happening in our teams, in our worlds. So then, shouldn't the conclusion be to remove ourselves from it? To remove that bias, I should be objective. I should be data-driven. I should let the data drive. What could go wrong? So, the thing about letting the data drive is that something's missing. Right? And that something has to come from us. So statistical analysis can inform what we do, but it can't drive the process by itself. Let's check in with Indiana Jones. What does that look like? Indiana Jones shows us the value of exploring his context, exploring his environment, his world. He can take some of the information. He can take that information and have it shape the way he views the path to his goal. And it complicates the path that he takes. Sometimes he's got to do a little bit of extra moving around, things that don't allow him to directly approach his goal. But those are things that the data by itself couldn't provide. The data doesn't provide that map. Indiana Jones's experience provides that context. So this is what it means to be data informed. It means that we understand that not all data is useful to us at all times. Therefore, not all analyses are useful to us at all times. So we do have a lot of information at our disposal. So data volley station analysts like myself, and access to volumetrics means that we can find lots of data very easily. We can generate lots of data really easily. So here I have a tactical analysis that I have printed out from volumetrics. This is over 90 pages of data. And some of it's useful to me right now. That does not mean that this is not useful, period. It just means that sometimes, in some places, in some situations, it is to me. How do I figure that out? What can data mean to us on our search? This is the challenge. This is the work we need to do to create our own contexts. Because the answers that we seek in our searches are shaped by what is important to us, by our individual contexts. We provide the contexts, we provide the meaning. And that meaning that we provide, the context that we provide, is what makes the numbers make sense, rather than the other way around. So this means when we talk about measuring what matters, we need to understand what matters. We need to understand what is important to us. So in the context of our search, what makes us better? What do we think will help us win? What do we think will help us improve? So what matters should drive what kinds of data we analyze and when we choose to analyze it. So this idea should tell us then that the targets we create, the goals that we move towards, are subjective. They're not objective. They are subjective because they're determined by our individual contexts. And so I can't just take someone else's target as my own, because our contexts are more than likely different. I need to be able to ask myself, are we aiming at the same target or not? Because chances are we're not aiming at the same targets. And then the question becomes, how close together are the targets at which we're aiming? Because no matter how small the difference is, that difference is important, because what we're going to find then is that as those differences accumulate, answers become less and less applicable. Right? My solution doesn't work for you in your context because it's your context and it differs from mine. So I have now set up this question: what matters to you? What matters in your world, on your teams, in your gym? And how are you measuring, or could you measure what matters to you? Please, write. All right, I get that there are lots and lots of different things that can matter to us. And so I want us to have some good time to discuss this. And I also want, during this discussion, take some time to discuss not just what your context is and what your contributors' contexts are, But how do they differ? Start recognizing how targets differ from one another. Go for it. All right. So Deming said that without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Seems like someone in my position would say, right? Here's someone who's way better at what I do, saying that even with data, you're still just another person with an opinion. And that's our context. That opinion does matter. It's how do we leverage the data that we can get according to what our opinions might be. So, yes, statistical analysis is important. Or at least that's what someone who gets paid to do it says. So there's more to it, though. It's not just what stats should I use? What analysis should I use? Those aren't the lessons that I hope that you take away from this. The lessons here are not what data should I use? It's what lessons should I learn from how we use data? What lessons can I, as a decision maker, as a coach, learn from analysis? First thing is that decisions are really just another form of measurement. Kahneman says that it's a measurement in which the instrument is a human mind. Decision making is a measurement. And so as we've seen from other measurements that we can take, they're variable. Our decisions are variable. We are noisy, just like performance is noisy. And so we need to be able to separate some different kinds of noise, some kinds of uncertainty. Statistics as a field doesn't remove uncertainty. Statistics gives us a way of understanding that uncertainty. And so Galef tells us that is one kind of uncertainty. That is what she refers to as uncertainty in the world, caused by the fact that the world is variable, the world is messy and unpredictable. But she separates that from uncertainty in me. And that uncertainty in me can have a lot of causes, one of which is the uncertainty in the world. So in a sense, Galef is inviting us to be certain about uncertainty. We need to be comfortable looking at, talking about, understanding that uncertainty exists. For instance, here is a tool, one particular type of tool that you might see in analysis. Box and whisker plots. These are ways that we can take a simple average and get a better understanding of the structure of the data that gives rise to that average. And I don't necessarily need to know a ton about what's the upper whisker, what's the upper hinge, what's the median, the lower hinge, the lower whisker. Maybe I need to know about that, maybe I don't. But just seeing this should shift our perspective, our mentality about the performances that we are measuring with these. As Galef said, I don't need to appear certain, because if I can't be sure of the answer, no one can be. That's a respect expert talking. And so another thing that we can learn from data analysis is to think in bets. Annie Duke wrote an entire book about it. A few ideas from this. How do I get better at thinking in bets? First, I can think of factors, not mechanisms. Remember how I asked you to write down your ideas about a particular skill, about the different factors that could affect the outcomes that we might see in that performance? How many of those can I name? And recognize that all of those factors might not be all of them that exist, but also recognizing that the better I get at seeing those, the better I get at recognizing that performance is complex. Next thing is to think in ranges rather than in discrete values. The box and whisker plots that I showed you, that's what it means to think in ranges. To understand, even if you don't have that plot to look at, you understand that variability in performance exists, whether you can visualize it or not. I begin to think in ranges of possible performances, possible outcomes. And that allows me then to think in bets. How likely do I think a particular outcome is compared to other possible outcomes? This might be the key in thinking in bets, is that it's not, do I think that this outcome is likely to happen or not? It's recognizing that there are many different outcomes in the valley of the normal. And of those different outcomes, how likely is this one that I'm focused on relative to the others? That's thinking in bets. And so as we recognize that there are many outcomes that are possible, and that sometimes we like to feel in control even though we're not, we should recognize that outcomes then do not tell us the quality of our decisions. Equating those two things is what's known in the poker world as resulting. Ladenau talks about it this way. He says the connection between actions and results is not as direct as we might believe. Duke defines resulting as the tendency to equate the quality of the decision with the quality of its outcome. And this is something that we're really good at doing. So let's go back to our tale of two tailors. So what if I know that Taylor 1 hits 30% or is 30% kill? Taylor 2 is 25% kill. Those vertical lines there represent 30% and 20%. And I have these two simulations that just give us an idea of one possible set of outcomes that can happen with my two tailors. Let's consider 300 attack attempts for my two tailors. And as that plays out, we see these curves moving around those two lines that represent their individual averages. But even at the end, they aren't at those averages. So let's say that I know, based on at least a season's worth of data, that the two tailors have those two kill percentages. Let's say that that is statistically significant information. I can then take 300 swings from each of them and see that they might still not be at those averages. Does that mean then that any decisions that I make around these two tailors, maybe I said Taylor 1 gets 30% kill, she's my 0-1. And yet after I see 300 swings of her and she's below that average, should I then say, well, that was a bad decision? That's resulting. So what do I need to do instead? What would Indy do? So here we see Indy following his decision-making process. He has a process in place. He's going to use his expertise, his knowledge, everything that he sees in his environment to try and figure out how to make this consequential decision as well as he can. So is it a good decision? How about now? Is it a good decision? This is resulting. This is the thing that we're really good at doing. We can look at Indy and say, oh, well, clearly that was a bad choice. He chose wrong. Or in the context of us in sport, clearly he lost. If I look at my decision, if any decision that I might have made that favored Taylor 1 over Taylor 2, I can say that was a bad choice, right? But that's not necessarily true, right? It's not about being right, winning. It's about doing it right. It's about having a process and following it. So winning and losing are only loose signals of decision quality. And so if that's true, then if we aren't wrong just because things didn't work out, then we aren't right just because things turned out well. So we might say that Indy lost, but that doesn't mean that he decided poorly. We might say we picked the wrong Taylor, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the process by which we made that decision was bad. And so that leads us to another lesson that we can take from analysis, and that is that we, like the data, are variable. Kahneman puts it this way: if you're shown a complex judgment problem, your mood in the moment may influence your approach to the problem, whether you think it does or not. That's the really hard part for us. In short, you are noisy. So how do we mitigate that? One of the ideas that Kahneman has in noise is called estimate, talk, estimate. And I've given you a little bit of practice at the first 2/3 of this. Estimate, talk, estimate requires participants first to produce separate and silent estimates, all that writing, then to explain and justify them to others, to your staff, to your friends, things like that. Then, the third part, which we haven't had to do here, is where we construct a consensus judgment that incorporates the judgments of each of the people in our group. And research shows that that consensus judgment is more likely to be accurate than any one of our individual judgments. And by accurate, it's important that we recognize accurate in the realm of thinking in bets. Accurate is not right or wrong. It is not prediction matching outcome. Accurate means that it best describes what happens, or it best describes the possibilities, really, not what actually happens, but what is possible to happen. And so in the case of the Tale of Two Tailors, the kinds of questions that we should be asking in Estimate, Talk, Estimate would be, under which circumstances should I switch tailors? What should the stats look like in practices leading up to that? What might the situation be in the match itself that leads us to make a change? It's putting that process in place and discussing it beforehand that sets us up to make better decisions. So I go back to the last question that I asked in our search. How should we practice, scout, and compete to move towards better? And what I recommend is that we rephrase that to say, how should we decide to practice, scout, and compete in order to move towards better? If we recognize that outcomes are variable no matter what we do, then we're not measuring our decisions based on what happens in a practice, what happens in a match. Did I get it right? Did the thing that we predicted in our scouting report actually happen in the match? That's not right. That's not accurate, right? So we need to think, how do we decide on our game plan? How did we decide on what we're going to do against an opponent? Galef sums it up this way, that over time your outcomes will fluctuate. Some of your bets will turn out well, many won't. But the goal is to mentally separate the role that luck plays from the role that our decision-making plays. And we should be judging ourselves based on the latter. So, now what would you think? What would you do? Write down, what's one way you can take what you've heard here and go be a different coach as a result? Another question, who is someone that you can talk about what matters with? All right. I'm going to leave. Whoop, let me turn the mic back on. I will leave you to discuss this in the time that we have remaining between now and the next presentation. Here's my contact information. By all means, please reach out. If you want to hear my opinions on stats, again, I can share those too. But I want to thank you very much for your participation and your attention. But please, take time now, before we pack up and head out, to discuss these ideas. What are you going to do? Because that's where the learning is. It's not in what you wrote down, it's what you go home and do. Please discuss. Thank you.